And now I want to put a lot of these techniques and color mixing concepts into practice with just a few simple demonstrations of how we can use these techniques to create some more finished paintings so that you can actually see how these techniques and color mixing concepts apply to an actual watercolor painting. So here you can see I have two rectangles, and I'm going to be kind of simultaneously demonstrating these two different paintings. And the reason I'm doing two at the same time is just because while I'm waiting for things to dry on one painting, I can just go ahead and work a little bit on the other painting. And this is how I frequently do paint with watercolor, especially if I know that I'm going to have at least one painting that has a lot of glazing techniques where I need to wait for things to dry. I'll have another project, even if it's just a small side project, on hand that I can kind of fiddle around with while I'm waiting for things to dry on the initial painting. And this is just to kind of keep me occupied while I wait so I don't get impatient and try to rush ahead. So on this top rectangle, I'm going to be demonstrating what is called negative painting. Negative painting is something that we need to understand in watercolor because watercolor is a transparent medium, and we typically are going to build up our values by applying our lightest values first and then building our darker values up over time. And this can be a little bit of a challenging aspect of watercolor painting when you have a subject in your foreground that is lighter in value than your background. A lot of times what we will be doing with watercolor painting is painting in an entire background, for example, a sky, which tends to be lighter in value than the foreground or trees or anything that might be in front of it. And so we can paint the entire sky, not worry at all about the foreground or trees or whatever else is in front of the sky because they're darker in value than the sky. And then we can just add those on top when we get there. But when we have a subject that's actually lighter in value than the background, we need to approach it just a little bit differently. So what I'm going to be painting here for an example of a negative painting is a white duck sitting on some grass in kind of a shadowy area. So you can see I went ahead and just kind of loosely applied some color to the duck. I'm making the shadow a little bit of a blue-violet because the duck is white, and so we could either mix up a gray, or what I usually try to do is have a really chromatic gray for my shadow colors. So a lot of times I'll choose some kind of variation of a violet. And then I'm going to go ahead and just block in some really light green into the background, just around the duck. And the duck is still wet, so there's going to be a little bit of merging, but that's totally okay. In fact, with watercolor, sometimes that's really desirable, just to have some nice, loose, soft edges where things are kind of merging together. It makes it a little bit more visually interesting in the long run. So we're not going to worry about anything like that right now. We're just going to embrace the way that the water wants to flow. And I'm kind of just blocking in a lot of these lighter, more vibrant colors right now. And you can see that I'm working around the duck. So this is kind of a very simple way of doing a negative painting. Of course, right now everything's very soft and merging together. And we'll go a little bit darker once these initial washes and this initial block in has a chance to dry a little bit. But basically what I'm going to want to do is paint the dark background around our subject, which is that white duck. So once we have everything in place, doesn't need to be perfect by any means. In fact, with watercolor, we really want to embrace the imperfections and let things just happen the way that they're going to happen. And what we really want to make sure that we don't do is try to exert too much control over our watercolor by trying to prevent certain things from merging. If there's two wet edges and they're touching, they're going to merge together. And so you can either wait for things to dry if it's really important to you to have a nice hard edge, or just embrace those accidental merges. And typically that is what we love to see in watercolor anyway. So while I let my duck dry, I'm going to go ahead and get started down here on this bottom rectangle where I'm going to be painting some clouds. And what I have in mind here are some nice pink clouds, and maybe the sun is setting a little bit. So I'm going to paint the brightest, most vibrant color first, and also what is going to be lightest in value. So those pink clouds, and then the sky is going to start merging into kind of an orangish yellow. I think my yellow might be a little bit strong here, but that's okay. We're just kind of playing around, and I'm just going to let those merge together, and as they dry, they will actually lighten in value just a little bit. And then here at the bottom, I think I'll just have a little bit of blue. We're just going to keep this very, very simple. And of course, the yellow and the blue, where they merge together, you might see a little bit of green. If I had watered down my yellow just a little bit more and let that be a little bit lighter, then it probably wouldn't be such an issue. I think that my yellow, I applied it just with a little too much saturation maybe. But again, that's just something that you'll get used to as you continue painting, just that balance between how much water and how much pigment you have. So I'm just testing to see how dry my duck painting is here. It's dried for just a little bit, and I know it's still a little bit damp, but I'm not exactly going to be applying any glazes here necessarily. But I'm going to go in with a much darker value, and this is basically just a very dark violet. And I'm going to start, again, painting around the lighter areas. So even the areas in that initial block-in or wash layer with the duck, even the darker aspects of that painting are going to seem light in comparison with the darker values that I'm applying now that I've given this a little bit of a chance to dry. So again, I'm painting with this darker value around everything else that I want to be much lighter. And to get that darker value, what we need to make sure to do is to have a lot of pigment and not so much water. And here's where I have to be just a little bit more careful so that I don't accidentally paint into my white duck. And this is the most challenging thing about doing any kind of negative painting, is having to paint around your lighter subject. And the one thing about watercolor that a lot of people feel very intimidated by is that if you place a lot of pigment into an area where you didn't want it, it's very, very difficult to go back. So a lot of people see watercolor as being very unforgiving, but honestly, it's really just a matter of understanding the behavior of watercolor, knowing when you need to wait, knowing where you need to be careful and where you may not necessarily need to be careful at all. It's just about finding that balance between having some level of control that just comes from experience, and also knowing when to let go of control and allow that water to flow the way that it will. So I'm adding just a little bit of orange to the beak, and what I'm going to find out is that because that darker violet color that I just placed around the duck is still pretty wet, and I applied that orange to the beak, those are going to merge together a little bit. And so what I'll do is I'll actually go in with my paper towel and lift it out a little bit, but you'll see that. And that's another great thing about the technique of lifting, because we can use it to create really nice subtle edges, or we can actually use it to try to mitigate some mistakes that we might make with watercolor. So if you go in with your paper towel and kind of blot it in an area, sometimes you can lift a lot of that pigment up off of an area where you don't necessarily want it. And again, I need to keep these values pretty dark, so I need a lot of pigment, not quite so much water. And this contrast is going to make that duck feel very light and white. Even though when I first started painting the duck, I actually applied quite a bit of pigment to the duck, just to build up some shadows and a little bit of color variation within the duck. So here I just picked up a little bit of that pigment, and you can see it also removed some of the orange. So I'll have to go back in a little bit with a little bit more orange onto the beak. But for now, I know that I just need to let things settle and dry a little bit. So let's move on back to the clouds. So I'm using the same mix that I had that's kind of a neutral violet, and I'm using this to start to define some of the clouds. And so this is basically kind of a glazing technique because I've allowed those initial colors in the sky to dry and settle a little bit, and now I can go in and add a little bit of contrast within these clouds, which will allow the areas that are remaining pink to appear more like really light pink clouds at sunset. So I don't want to overdo it. And I'm also not necessarily trying to mimic any actual clouds here, but I want to add a little bit of texture, a little bit of movement. And you can see that when I glaze with this violet on top of those brighter colors, it actually makes those colors seem even more vibrant and bright in the areas where they're still showing through. And so before I move on with this painting, I'm going to allow this glaze to kind of settle and dry, and then I can add a finishing touch to my duck painting. And then when we get back to the cloud painting, I will show you how to mix up a nice neutral black, and we'll add some silhouettes of trees to the foreground to really make that sunset feel like a nice skyscape. So you can see here I just added a little bit more of that bright, vibrant orange back into our duck, and our negative painting here is done. So you can see that most of the work that I did in that negative painting was actually around the subject. And I even let some of the white of the paper show through just at the very top of the duck's head. And that gives a really nice sense of light and vibrancy to that painting. So that is an example of how we would do negative painting. It takes a little bit of planning ahead, thinking ahead, knowing what areas you really need to leave alone and what areas you're going to need to build up. All right, so here I'm going to show you how to mix a nice neutral black using just your primary colors. Basically, it's going to be a combination of all three colors. It's just a matter of finding the right balance between those three colors. I usually find that if I want to mix a real true black, I'm going to be using a lot of blue, a medium amount of red, and then maybe just a little bit of yellow to tone it down, because of course blue and red are just going to make a violet, but if we add a little bit of yellow to our violet, that's going to neutralize the violet and help it to appear a little bit more black. And a lot of times in painting, I will actually not use a true black, like a black out of a tube at all, because I really prefer to mix my blacks and my neutrals very chromatically. So I'm not necessarily after getting a true black. I actually want my black to lean a little bit toward one color or another. So as I said, for black, I might want my mixture to lean more strongly toward blue. And if I'm mixing a warm neutral like a brown, then I might have more of my red or my yellow dominating that mix, but it's still going to have some blue in it just to neutralize it. So here you can see I started out with a somewhat lighter, almost gray, to start blocking in some of these trees. And what I'm doing is I'm applying the color pretty thick at the bottom where the ground is, but as I move up the tree, I'm using more of a dry brush technique so that I get more texture. And I am by no means going in and trying to paint every single branch, because these are trees that are kind of in the distance. So while I want them to be a little rough and I want to be able to see that sunset sky through the branches, what I really want to have is a nice rough texture within the mass of the trees. So I'm using a dry brush technique and almost a scumbling technique to apply those trees on top of the sky. And at the bottom, it's more of a wet onto dry technique because it's going to be more solid where the ground is. And then I was looking at my duck and realized maybe I could add a little bit of this nice chromatic black just right underneath the duck to help it feel a little bit more grounded, give it a little bit more of a stronger base. And I think that that does help a lot. And because I've allowed it to dry, I get a little bit more of a hard edge and less merging between the colors. So I can do just a little bit more with this very dark value to really help my duck feel like it's sitting on the ground. And also when you're doing a black, if you are needing it to be very, very dark and strong, of course, you just want to make sure that you have a lot more pigment to water. So not much water, lots and lots of pigment, you'll get a nice dark value. And of course, if you are wanting to mix up a gray, then you would just add a little bit more water to your mix to dilute it a little bit more, and you're going to get a lighter value. So here you can see in my cloud painting, I allowed just a very small dot of white to show through. So that's just the white of the paper, and that kind of symbolizes where the setting sun is. And it really creates a really nice sense of luminosity and vibrance. And that's offset by the silhouette of all of these masses of trees. And then of course we have those nice pink clouds in the top portion of the sky, and I think that that just helps it to feel like a really nice sunset. This is the kind of sunset that I see a lot in my neck of the woods here in Nebraska, so those are probably my favorite clouds to paint. All right, so I hope that you enjoyed this class. I hope that you are able to take some of these techniques that we went over today and apply them to some very simple paintings. Keep your subjects really simple to begin with, and just try to look for ways to apply these basic techniques in ways that they build up to almost appear very complex.